Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our series on the topic of how to establish sanitariums or wellness centers or other types of medical things in the last days. God's plan is clear, and we're going to dive right into that today. Let us begin with prayer as we do. Father in heaven, thank you for loving us so much that you provide counsel to show us how we can collaborate with you and win souls to your kingdom through that collaboration. I just pray for your blessing today as we study, as we open your word, in Jesus' name. Amen. Turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 gives us a thumbnail sketch of the life of a man who understood some very relevant things related to wellness centers and other soul-winning activities. We read in verse 21 that Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. Verse 22, and Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Look what happened. Enoch lived in a very wicked and degenerate age. Lot, in contrast to Enoch, which of course was after the flood, Lot dwelt towards Sodom, or pitched his tent towards Sodom. He actually moved into the city eventually. It drew him in, whereas Enoch kept himself separate from the wickedness of the world around him. And it's very interesting, some of the statements we have concerning Enoch. Hebrews 11 verse 5 tells us that by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. Now I want you to notice that the Bible says that he was not found. That tells you that there were those that looked for him. They tried to find him. They did not know what happened to him, and in the end, they could not find him. Manuscript 200, 1899 says this. This is Ellen White writing. She says, the sons of God were thus called because they were the visible worshipers. The openly wicked were descendants of Cain. Enoch did not take up his abiding place among them, because the sight of the eyes and the hearing of the ears were dangerous to his family. He lived away in country places, retired, and at set times he visited the wicked inhabitants to bear his testimony in harmony with the message that that would be borne by Noah and other sons of God. So in other words, Enoch was a man who spent his time walking with God. He focused his energy on understanding God. He spent many hours in nature and kept himself aloof from the wickedness of the world. Yet he did not isolate himself completely. He went into the places where the wicked people lived and began to witness to them. And the Bible actually tells us what he told them. He was a prophet. And in Jude, the book of Jude, we read the following very interesting remark. Jude, verse 14. It says, and Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints. He's talking about the second coming. He's prophesying about the second coming. To execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Now, Enoch walked with God, and yet he did not live in the midst of any city polluted by every kind of violence and wickedness, as did Lot in Sodom. And now he goes and he preaches to them about the prophecies of the second coming of Christ. He was, of course, a commandment keeper. He followed the principles of the Ten Commandments, even though they had not been delivered yet to Israel, which would be some many years later. Yet he understood the principles of true worship, and he kept God's holy Sabbath. He refused to be polluted by sin, and God's commandment-keeping people in these last days, Ellen White makes this comment, we must leave the cities. As did Enoch, we must work in the cities, but not dwell in them. That's her remark, Manuscript 85, 1899. We need the pure atmosphere of the country with the fresh and natural surroundings, my friends. The birds, the animals, the other things of nature, the flowers, the trees, all these things draw us to God's second book, inspired by God himself, the book of nature. Here's from Manuscript 42, 1900. Enoch walked with God, though living in a time no more favorable to perfection of Christian character than the time in which we live. He did not make his abode with the wicked. He did not locate in Sodom, thinking to save Sodom. He placed himself and his family where the atmosphere would be as pure as possible. Then at times he went forth to the inhabitants of the world with his God-given message. Every visit he made to the world was painful to him. He saw and understood something of the leprosy of sin. Now listen to this very insightful statement. After proclaiming his message, he always took back with him to his place of retirement some who had received the warning. Now you can imagine his family at home in their retired place in the countryside, and as Enoch starts coming up that hill to this home, his children, perhaps Methuselah, noticed that he was coming with somebody, and he would tell his mother, Dad is bringing home somebody, and no doubt it would be somebody that had responded to the call of his evangelism and who would be benefited by coming to his country property. But some had lived so long, let me start with this sentence. Some of these became overcomers and died before the flood came. So some of the people that came out there with Enoch into his country retirement were converted and became overcomers and lived for Christ. They died before the flood, she says. But some had lived so long in the corrupting influence of sin that they could not endure righteousness. They did not retain their purity of faith, but returned to their former customs and practices. And you know, it happens so often that some people who come to our wellness centers, they are very impressed. And some of them, you know, respond and become overcomers. Others go back to their lifestyle, go back to their wicked ways, after they have gained the blessing and the benefit, the health benefits of the wellness retreat, and they go back to their old problems. It's a tragedy, but it happens. Nobody can be forced to make the right decisions. Everybody has to choose between right and wrong. So some of the people came out to Enoch's retreat, and some of them changed their ways. Others returned to their city homes. So Enoch is an example to us. We are to work the cities from outside the cities, what is known as an outpost. This is very important to understand when it comes to wellness centers. Wellness centers are not intended to be in the cities. Our sanitariums should be out of the cities, said Ellen White in Review and Herald, August 11, 1904. She said, one who is unerring in counsel has given this direction in mercy to suffering humanity. Physicians and ministers are called upon to exert their influence in favor of establishing our sanitariums, publishing houses, and schools out of the cities. And for the sake of the youth in our schools and publishing houses, and for the sake of the patients and helpers in our sanitariums, this should be done. One unerring in counsel, that would be God, has given the advice that we are to establish outposts outside the major cities where we can do sanitarium work or wellness centers, schools, and also publishing houses. And today, unfortunately, we justify locating some of our denominational schools and medical centers in the cities. We do not follow the counsel of the Lord. And our hospitals are naturally located in the cities today because we have refused to obey God's counsel. But God has given self-supporting workers the opportunity to take up the work that others have neglected. They can follow the inspired counsel and have success. But God's counsel is pointedly clear. We're not to erect in the cities large buildings in which to care for the sick, because God has plainly indicated that the sick can be better cared for outside the cities. That's 7T, page 60, or the 7th volume of the Testimonies for the Church, page 60. I have been instructed to tell our brethren to keep on the lookout for cheap, desirable properties in healthful places, suitable for sanitarium purposes. That's Testimonies, volume 7, page 98. Of course, cheap would not mean poorly constructed. That would mean inexpensive. You know, sometimes there's some very interesting experiences that we have. You know, people of the world make their buildings for themselves, and then they fall into the hands of God's people because of some reverses or some need to move on or whatever. So the people of the world create places that eventually can be used as places for God's people to minister to the sick. Out of the cities is my message. Those who have had the light but have neglected to follow the instruction of the Lord that the Lord has given regarding the location of our health institutions and schools will one day see the folly of clinging to the cities. They will realize how kind the Lord was to point out the right way. So in other words, God has given us clear counsel, and we are to follow this in our planning and erecting of institutions or places where the sick can be healed. And by the way, they don't have to be large. A home-style wellness center is a very effective tool, especially for medium or small-sized cities. Whereas in a larger place with larger concentrations of population, then we may need a larger facility. But the point here is that wherever and whatever these facilities may be, they should be out in the country outside of a city within a reasonable distance, so that, of course, they can minister to the people in the city, and the city people can come out to the retreat. By Lot's experience, we learn what happens when we pitch our tent toward the city. Lot was drawn into the city of Sodom, and in the end, he lost everything. Everything but the clothes on his back, even lost his wife. And his 2 daughters were very compromised themselves spiritually, as the after events reveal. Here's another statement from Special Testimonies Series B, page 10. I have tried to place before our people the representations given me regarding sanitariums in the country, and I have urged upon them the necessity of establishing our sanitarium outside of the cities. I have had repeatedly presented to me the advantage of securing locations some miles out of the cities. Those who follow the counsel of God in providing places where the sick and suffering can receive proper treatment will be guided to the right places for the establishment of their work. I wonder how far is appropriate for a wellness center from a city. You know, you can go too far and you can be too close. And hopefully we'll see some evidence that will help us understand this in the future. Another letter, letter 182 from 1902 says this: the cities are to be worked from outposts. Said the messenger of God, shall not the cities be warned? Yes, not by God's people living in them, but by their visiting them to warn them of what is coming upon the earth. We are to follow in the footsteps of Enoch. The way Enoch worked is the way we are to work. We go and impress the people with the need to know God or to improve their health or whatever it may be, and they come out to the outpost. That's where we can really talk to them about their relationship to God. They're in the surroundings that are really nice because of the nature and the fresh air and the good food that is provided to them. All of these things clear them up in their minds and in their bodies so that they're more capable of understanding God's will for their lives. There is a divinely inspired blueprint. And this statement that I just read seems to explain this concept a little bit. The cities are to be worked from outposts. The health retreat is to be located at the outpost, where other activities are also conducted. But certain things are to be done in the city. We are to establish city centers of influence. And hopefully you'll understand this a little better as we go on through this presentation. Blueprint means plans. Plans for building, plans for constructing a system of working. And those plans for spiritual ministry are just as relevant today as when they were back in the days that these statements were written by the pen of inspiration. Those interested in the work of wellness centers should try to either join with a group who have developed the concept and are at least working toward the blueprint design, or start developing the blueprint model oneself. We'll work on this in our work down in Australia. We're working on this now, actually. We've already designed an enterprise model that includes the concept of the blueprint, the city center of influence, and the outpost, and the two working together. These are part of the blueprint that we're developing for our work in Australia. And it's very important that we talk about this, and perhaps we can do some of this a bit later on. But let's come back to the topic of the location of our buildings. In the second volume of Selected Messages, page 358, we read the following: repeatedly, the Lord has instructed us that we are to work the cities from outpost centers. In these cities, we are to have houses of worship as memorials for God, but institutions for the publication of our literature, for the healing of the sick, and for the training of workers are to be established outside the cities. Especially is it important that our youth be shielded from the temptations of city life. Now let's think about this for a minute. So there's two different locations where we are to work: the cities and the country. What kind of entities are to be established in the cities? Well, houses of worship. We call that a church. That's right. As memorials for God. But our publishing houses, our sanitariums, our wellness centers, and our schools are to be located outside. So now we have the concept in principle. There are a couple of other things, however, that should be in the cities as well. And we'll get to those in a minute. There should be sanitariums near all our large cities. Did you hear that? Sanitariums or wellness centers should be established near all our large cities. Advantages should be taken of the opportunities to purchase buildings in favorable locations, that the standard of truth may be planted in many places. That's Medical Ministry, page 324. All of our major cities, that's a lot of small wellness centers and sanitariums. Think about it. That's a lot. There's a lot of cities. And we could list many of them just in the United States alone, let alone other countries. All our major cities. So we need a lot of workers to help with all these little wellness centers around if such a thing were to happen. Unfortunately, most people don't seem to understand this call or accept this call to establish or help to establish little wellness centers outside every major city. Here's another point, it's very interesting, regarding location from the second volume of Selected Messages, page 301. We read the following: "The Lord has been giving me light in regard to many things. He has shown me that our sanitariums should be erected on as high an elevation as is necessary to secure the best results, and that they are to be surrounded by extensive tracts of land, beautified by flowers and ornamental trees." Wow. An elevation as high as is necessary to get the best results. In other words, you want to be above any smog, if possible. And as often as possible, we need to be out of any kind of perhaps downwind location from major cities whose pollution spreads out over the valleys. That's very important consideration when looking for a location. You really should be upwind from a big city if possible. That's the best way. Our place in Victoria is an elevation of 1,300 feet. And it's not very high, but it's high enough. And we're also upwind from Melbourne, so we don't get a lot of pollution from the city that comes up there. It's very pure atmosphere, and we have a lot of ornamental trees and flowers that beautify the 102 acres that we have there. In South Australia, our place has 20 acres, and it's in a very rural setting. We have a couple of neighbors that are quite close, but you can hardly see them because of the trees that populate around the property. And it has a water course running right through it with a large lake there in front of the main lodge. It's a beautiful spot, and I hope that we can show you some pictures before we're finished. But she doesn't exactly say what elevation is the best. So you have to choose the best thing you can find. It means unpolluted air. It means fresh water. It means a mountain area or a hilly area at least, where you can be attracted by nature, where the patients and the guests can gain much. I was involved in giving some guidance to a school and wellness center in Brazil a while back near the city of Rio de Janeiro. And it's very interesting what they found as far as property is concerned. They found a place that was just outside the last suburb to the north of Rio de Janeiro. And it was right up against a mountain. But between the city, the suburb, and the property where they purchased the location for their school and wellness center, there was a public park, and the only access to the property was through the public park. So in other words, people came to the park for recreation, but they were down in the park area, and once you get through the park, then you wind up the hill a little ways, and there is the location of the school and wellness center. It had a major fast-flowing stream running through the property, and it would come tumbling down the mountain. There were waterfalls, and it was an absolutely beautiful place, beautiful flowers and ornamental trees all over the property, and it was a lovely spot. It was a place that they found uniquely preserved for this work, no doubt by the hand of God. Also, I was involved in a school and wellness center in terms of consulting and participating in the process of getting it established in the country of Sweden. An entirely different type of landscape, entirely different type of people, and the national personality was quite different, needless to say, than the Brazilians. But here they found a property way out in the countryside, not so far from Malmö, which is there in the southwest part of Sweden, and established their school and wellness center there. Again, it was a very attractive place and could have been a very effective place. Unfortunately, the circumstances developed and the organization did not continue. But nevertheless, it was an ideal location for such a place. I could tell you other stories about places and the locations of places that have been established. But always you find the outpost centers outside of the city is where the schools, the wellness centers, and the publishing houses are to be. So when Ellen White talks about elevation, does she talk about mountains? Perhaps. I know of another place that's trying to get started at the moment. It's on the side of a mountain, a very steep mountain, and it's just there on the side, sort of hanging over, you know, the valley. And it's a very difficult place to work because it is, you know, there's not a lot of walking trails where people can walk on level ground. You know, some people are so compromised that you have to give them level walking areas. It can't just be steep up and steep down all the time if you're going to be able to give them the exercise that they need. Other clients and guests can do more aggressive walking, so perhaps not far away there needs to be some of the elevated and the up and down that they can walk and get their exercise that way. But you have to think about these things. If you build on a mountain, you need to also have a wide enough area where you have a place for those who are severely compromised to be able to get some exercise. Ellen White also mentions having a large tract of land. You may remember that statement. She said that extensive tracts of land is the term she uses. You may not need to have a lot of property that you own, but you could be up against national forest or state parks. You could be near other rural farms with lots of rural roads where the patients can walk. There's different ways to fulfill this counsel. You don't actually have to own all the property yourself. And in Victoria, for instance, we have, as I mentioned, lots of flowering plants and trees and beautiful grounds, but we also have lots of animals. The wallabies come out in the evening and in the morning, and they feed on the grass. It gives a very peaceful sense of of tranquility to the guests that come. We also have wombats. We have lots of colorful parrots. And it's a very attractive location for a health center or a wellness center. Here's another statement from Special Testimonies Series B, page 10, which says, "Let our sanitariums be located where there is an abundance of land." That doesn't necessarily, again, say that you have to own that land, but you should own some amount of land. In our small place over in South Australia near Adelaide, we have 20 acres. It's not a lot, but we have a lot of surrounding areas where there's a lot of elbow room. People can maneuver very nicely. And also in Victoria, we're right up against a state forest. In other words, people, if they want to, go out and walk, they can go through the forest. Off our campus, there are some roads through the forest that were used for logging at one stage, and they're very abundant, and you can, walk all over those. It's a very lovely place. Now, there's also an argument for owning at least some of the land, as I mentioned, because you have to be able to control certain elements on a campus such as you have with a wellness center. So Heartland has nearly 600 acres. And as I said, we have 102 acres in Victoria and 20 acres over in South Australia. I know of places that have 60 acres, 80 acres. So it varies quite widely when you think about it, but at least there's enough land that they can do what they need to do in each case. Here's another statement from 7th volume of the Testimonies, page 86. "It is the express will of God that our sanitarium shall be established as far from the cities as is consistent." That's interesting. "So far as possible, these institutions should be located in quiet, secluded places where opportunity will be afforded for giving the patients instruction concerning the love of God and the Eden home of our first parents, which through the sacrifice of Christ is to be restored to man." What does the expressed will of God mean? Well, that means that God intends that we follow the counsel. We are to find places that are secluded. They're not out in the open where everybody can just come and go and see everything, They're to be secluded, which means they're to be given a certain space around them so that there is a certain amount of perhaps privacy, if you want to put it that way. Stressed out people from the city need a place where they can be in peace and tranquility. They want the quiet of nature. Their busy, chaotic lives demand that they come for rest. And this is the important thing about the cities that we are to locate nearby. And the term near to the city, what does that mean? The term near to a city, it could vary, So let's see what Ellen White had to say about that. The 7th volume of the Testimonies again, page 79. "Many of the sick and suffering will turn from the cities to the country, refusing to conform to the habits, customs, and fashions of the city life. They will seek to regain health in some one of our country sanitariums. Thus, though we are removed from the cities 20 or 30 miles, we shall be able to reach the people. And those who desire health will have opportunity to regain it under conditions most favorable." All right, now let's think about this. 20 to 30 miles would be in those days at least an hour or two drive by horse and buggy from the city out to the wellness center. Well, today that would be 50 to 100 miles. perhaps 75 to 150 kilometers or something like that. In other words, the principle is that the distance should not be so far as it's difficult to get to, and secondly, it should not be too close so that it's crowded in by the city life and the city atmosphere. So from this, we can conclude at least that 50 to 100 miles is probably a good range. Our place in Victoria is about 55, 60 miles from the central business district of Melbourne. From the outer suburbs, we are probably 20 miles, 25 miles, something like that. Over in South Australia, we are about 55-minute drive from the airport and from the central business district of Adelaide. And there's a lot of rural communities in that area, and some of them are actually growing at a very rapid pace. But they're not close to us in terms of miles. Maybe they're 20 miles from us. Again, about 20 miles. Heartland is about 90 miles southwest of the central area of Washington, D.C., the government area of Washington, D.C. There are suburbs that are fairly close to us. About 15 miles away is the small town of Culpeper. And so it's one of the remote bedroom communities of Washington, D.C. Another community, the Warrenton community, is probably about 40 to 45 miles from us, and it's much closer into the city. In fact, it's about halfway between us and the city. So these are examples of the kind of location that you should expect to find or be looking for if you are interested in establishing a lifestyle or wellness retreat. So they shouldn't be too far. I mentioned the other day that I know of a wellness center that is 4 hours from a major city. And it's way out in the bush. It's out in the countryside, so far out in the forest that you really have to have a strong determination to find it and get there. I've tried to find it, and I did find it actually, though it took a bit of effort to get there, to visit. I try to visit wellness centers whenever I can. So I was out in that area, and I made sure that I was able to stop by and at least have a look. And, you know, it's going to struggle. They're doing a good work. They have sincere people. They're lovely people. But it's going to struggle because it's so far from the city. Most people are not going to go that far. And you also have to drive traffic to your website so that people find you. You know, there's many factors involved in keeping enough clients or patients and guests coming through the program. But being far from the city makes it even another barrier. You know, there's enough barriers as it is. And if you're going to have several barriers and difficulties, you're going to have to try and find a location that is close enough but far enough so that there's a consistency in how you run your program with the principles of the 8 natural remedies and the goals that you want to achieve with your guests. Now, I'd like to also point out that perhaps we should talk about these obstacles a little bit. When you're thinking about and planning your location as well as your program, you have to think about the people that will be coming to your program. What obstacles are there in their minds? You know, some people would have the obstacle of resistance to the idea of changing their lifestyle. That's one obstacle. There's a second obstacle, and that is that that might be location or distance. They don't want to travel very far. If they're going to to come to a place to get healing, they want to be able to have convenience, and so they want to come to some place that's reasonably close by. If they're going to go to some resort for a holiday, they'll get on a plane and they'll go there for a couple of weeks or whatever and then come back home. But for most people who want to recover their health, they're going to look for a place that's reasonably close by to where they live so that they can continue to, or at least the goal would be to continue to follow up with the natural means once they're convinced that that's the way of healing. One of our former clients, our former guest, who is now a member of God's church there in Victoria, lived near the city. She lived down by the central business district of Melbourne. Well, not so close to the central district, but one of the suburbs closer in, let's put it that way. She wanted to get out of the city and get out of it. She begged God to show her how to get out, and finally her husband agreed to sell their place in the suburb where they were living and buy a place closer to where we are up on the mountain over there in Victoria. And she excitedly came to me one day and she said, she says, I can't believe it. My husband agreed to sell and move out to a place called Healesville, which is about 20 miles from us. And she was absolutely ecstatic. And she said, now I can be close to Abide Wellness Retreat where I can continue my progress in healing. And that really it struck me as a very important aspect of this. There may be people who will want to even shift their residence from one place to another in order to be closer to the outpost. We don't want to build up big Jerusalem centers. I should point that out. You know, if there's a lot of Adventist people that gather around a place, you know, you want to avoid building up a big Jerusalem center, but there are times when it is necessary or it's convenient or appropriate for some to move out closer, at least, to the ideal that God has given us. Counsels on Health, page 554. But more important than magnificent scenery and beautiful surroundings and spacious grounds is the close proximity of these institutions to densely populated districts. That sounds like a contradictory statement to the ones we've been reading so far. I'll read on. And the opportunity thus afforded of communicating to many, many people a knowledge of the third angel's message. Now, is this a contradiction or is it consistent? What she's saying is, and I think we have to put this in the context. You know, you can't make inspired statements contradict each other. If you do that, you come to the wrong conclusion. What she's saying is that we need to be out in the country far enough as is consistent with the goals we want to achieve, but not too far. If we're too far out, we will have difficulty in achieving those goals. And we want to be able to reach many, many people. If we're too far out, we're only going to reach very few. But if we're too close in, then we're going to be crowded and we won't have the elbow room that we need. So it's a balance, you see. And Ellen White is eminently balanced. She is always going to give the balanced concepts. So this statement is not saying that we are to move into the suburbs. That's not what this is saying, because that would conflict with the other statements that we've just read. We are to have a reasonable driving distance from the city or the densely populated districts, as she says here. From 7th volume of the Testimonies, page 82, we read the following. In the future, the condition of things in the cities will grow more and more objectionable. Are the cities objectionable today? They certainly are. And the influence of city surroundings will be acknowledged as unfavorable to the accomplishment of the work that our sanitariums should do. What are the conditions that would be unfavorable? Well, the crime, the violence, the pollution, the noise, the stress. If you've ever been or ever lived in a major city, you know what I'm talking about. There's a constant hubbub of activity and noise and commotion, and it's ongoing day and night in some places, not to mention the crime and violence. Also, there's compromise in the city. Everything around you influences you in the wrong way, against God's principles, away from the principles of heaven. The social influences are that way. The prevailing opinions of the ungodly are that way. The gay lifestyles are now prevailing in the cities. You know, these cities are going to become targets not only of the enemy, but of God himself at some point in time. You know, God will allow the enemy to do his work of destruction, you know, for a period of time. But eventually, the last plagues, the 7 last plagues are going to be poured out on the cities, at least a lot of them, and they're going to be targets of divine judgment. Also, cities are targets of war and terrorism. Whenever there is a conflict between nations, it's the cities where they target their activities. And so they're not safe by any means and from any perspective. So why should sanitariums be in the cities? It makes no sense. Ellen White wrote this in a letter 182 in 1902. She says, "I am told that Dr. Kellogg advised the brethren to go ahead and build in the city of Los Angeles. But he did not know that the Lord has given instruction in regard to the need of getting out of the cities. As far as possible, our institutions should be located away from the cities. We must have workers for these institutions, and if they are located in a city, that means that families of our people must settle near them." Well, that's not God's plan. But it is not God's will that his people shall settle in the cities where there is constant turmoil and confusion. Their children should be spared this, for the whole system is demoralized by the hurry and the rush and the noise. Wow. So there you are. God's principle is that we are to live in the country. We're to minister to the from the country to the city. Country Living, page 13, says there's not one family in 100 who will be improved physically, mentally, or spiritually by residing in the city. Not 1 in 100. Faith, hope, love, happiness can far better be gained in retired places where there are fields and hills and trees. And also from medical ministry, here's a little twist to this whole concept. It may often be necessary to start sanitarium work in the city. But never build a sanitarium in the city. So is that inconsistent with what Ellen White has been saying in other places? No. It's simply saying you may have to start close in, but you are to build outside. The plan is to move it outside eventually. Rent a building and keep looking for a suitable place out of the city, she concludes. And here's from Special Testimonies, Series B, page 3. The Lord in his providence has opened the way for his workers to take an advanced step in New England, a field where much special work should be done. The brethren there have been enabled to arrange to change the location of the sanitarium from South Lancaster to Melrose, a place much nearer Boston, and yet far enough removed from the busy city so that the patients may have the most favorable conditions for recovery of health. The transfer of the New England Sanitarium to a place so convenient to the city of Boston is in God's providence. When the Lord sets his hand to prepare the way before us, God forbid that any should stand back, questioning the wisdom of going forward or refusing to give encouragement and help. In this case, they moved the sanitarium closer to the city. It was outside, which today is South Lancaster, Massachusetts, and it was too far from Boston that people didn't want to come out there. And so they moved it closer so that it would be easily accessible to the people of Boston. So many of God's people refuse to give encouragement or help to wellness centers. They criticize the work of those who move forward in a self-supporting way. They say things that they know nothing about. And they faithlessly denigrate the work of God and the work that God is trying to accomplish. And when they should encourage the workers by their donations, their moral support, instead they run them down. This is a feature of humanity, unsanctified humanity, that cannot see the advantages of doing the work that God has deliberately instructed us and specifically instructed us to do. Never should God's people discourage workers, self-supporting workers. You know, it happens that self-supporting work is a very important work. In fact, in our next presentation, I'm going to share with you some of the principles involved in self-supporting work directly. And people see these workers that are out there on their own. They're not asking the conference for support. They're not engaging in the compromises that you get in many denominational institutions. And yet people criticize them because they think that something isn't quite right, when they have no idea what's really going on. They find all manner of excuses to stand aloof. It's too far out in the country. It's too this, or it's not enough of that. It's, you know, on and on and on it goes. You have to expect, if you are a leader, or for that matter, a worker in a self-supporting wellness center, you have to expect criticism. There will be people who have no sense of God's purpose and God's hand over his work. So you have to be prepared to receive some flack, all right? Just putting it out there because, you know, the location, the size, the complexity of the organization, there are many things that are involved. So you need to be prepared for the attitudes, the wrong attitudes of some of God's people. We don't live in a good age. We live in a time of great difficulties. And if we don't move out now, we never will. And people who criticize are simply justifying their own lack of willingness to follow the counsel of the Lord. That's often how it is. Wellness centers should be shining lights set on a hill that can be seen by all. Medical Ministry, page 324. I wish to say that I do not see any objections to securing the buildings mentioned. The light given me is that buildings suitable for our work will be offered to us at a price far below their cost, making it possible for us to secure them. You know, some places come into distress, and then their prices go down and down and down. This happened to us when we were starting Heartland some years ago. The property was a very large tract of land. It had quite a few buildings on it, but it had fallen into considerable distress by the previous owner. And it was now actually entangled in a court case. But it was that very entanglement that God used so that we could secure that property at a very low price. And I'm very impressed by how God did that. I don't have time to give you all those details, but it's very important for us to remember that we look for places that are below market value or below market price, which means that they have a much larger value than what you would pay for. That's a statement, that's a comment that's related to this statement that I just read. Suitable buildings for our work offered at a price far below their cost. And when an opportunity presents itself to purchase at a low price buildings in which our work may be carried on, let us take advantage of these opportunities. Had this been done by the leaders of the medical work in such and such a place, there would now be many, many plants in our cities in America, cities that have not yet been enlightened by the truth upon health reform. And we still have that problem today. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. God designs that we shall learn lessons from the failures of the past. That's 9th volume of the Testimonies, page 71. We have reached the time when we must give character to the work by refusing to erect large and costly buildings. We're not to copy the mistakes of the past and become more involved in debt. So debt is another issue that's very important to think about. We are to beware of going beyond our means, and essentially we are to find ways to conduct the work in an efficient manner, especially with the use of finances in relation to the property that is purchased. So that should help us to understand a little bit more of God's will concerning the future. And I pray that as the sanitariums get started in these last days, wellness centers, lifestyle centers, health retreats, whatever you wish to call them, that we start them outside of every major city. You know, we've got a lot of work to do. And I hope that you have learned from this that at least there are some key principles that need to be followed. So let's close with prayer and ask God's blessing upon this work. Father in heaven, thank you so much for guiding us into a knowledge of your principles of truth for these last days in regard to wellness centers. I pray that you will give us wisdom and understanding and that we may be able to grasp the key elements that need to be in place for this work. And we thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.